It was just before midnight, March 31st, 1944. Somewhere over the waters east of the Philippines, a Japanese flying boat was losing its fight with a typhoon. Inside that plane sat one of the most powerful admirals in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had spent his entire career climbing to the very top of the most feared fleet in the Pacific. He was clutching a leather briefcase. The plane went down hard. Some men didn't make it out of the water that night. He did, barely, half-conscious, gasping, clinging to whatever wreckage he could find in the dark. And the briefcase? Gone. In the days that followed, this admiral would find himself sitting across a table from American intelligence officers, calm, composed, giving them nothing. He had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. And he was certain, absolutely certain, that whatever those Americans were fishing for, they weren't going to find it. He was wrong, because what was inside that briefcase hadn't sunk to the bottom of the sea. It had already been read. To understand what was in that briefcase and why losing it mattered so much, you have to understand where Japan stood in the spring of 1944. 2 years earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable. They had swept across the Pacific in a matter of months: the Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, Burma, island after island, falling like dominoes. But then came Midway, in June of 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the backbone of their naval air power, sunk in a single afternoon. Japan lost not just ships that day. They lost experienced pilots, seasoned crews, and the kind of momentum that, once broken, is very hard to get back. Then Guadalcanal. 6 months of brutal fighting in the jungle and at sea, ending in a Japanese withdrawal in February of 1943. By early 1944, the tide had turned, and everyone on both sides knew it. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur were pushing westward across the Pacific with a strategy that confounded the Japanese at every turn. They called it island hopping. The idea was simple, but ruthless. You don't attack every Japanese stronghold. You pick your targets carefully. Take the ones that matter, cut off the ones that don't, and let the garrisons on bypassed islands wither on the vine. Japan couldn't defend everywhere at once, and they were beginning to realize it. The high command in Tokyo knew they needed something, a line they could hold, a strategy bold enough, comprehensive enough to stop the American advance before it reached the home islands. They called it the absolute national defense sphere, and to defend it, they needed a plan. That plan came from Admiral Mineichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the man who had stepped into the enormous shadow left by the death of the legendary Isoroku Yamamoto. Koga was not Yamamoto, but he was thorough, and he was serious. What he put together was called Operation Z. It was not a single document so much as a complete blueprint for how Japan intended to fight and win the next great naval battle of the war. It laid out where the fleet would be positioned, which island chains would be defended at all costs, how the Navy's air power would be coordinated with ground forces, what Japan would do if the Americans came from the east, what they would do if they came from the south. Every contingency, every fallback, every card Japan still had to play, written down, organized, and stamped with the highest classification in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Only a handful of senior officers were ever allowed to read it. Koga kept one copy. He gave another to his Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, with instructions to keep it secure during their upcoming transfer of headquarters. It was, to put it plainly, the single most sensitive document in the Japanese Pacific Command. And Fukudome put it in a briefcase and carried it onto an airplane in the middle of typhoon season. Now, who was Shigeru Fukudome? He was, by any measure, the product of a system designed to produce men who did not fail. He had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima, the Japanese equivalent of Annapolis, but with a reputation for being even more demanding, more unforgiving, more focused on instilling a particular kind of pride in the men who passed through its gates. Fukudome had risen steadily through the ranks over more than 2 decades. Staff assignments, command postings, the kind of career that doesn't happen by accident. By 1944, he was one of Koga's most trusted officers, and he carried with him the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years being told and believing that the Imperial Japanese Navy was a force no enemy could fully understand, let alone defeat. That confidence would serve him well in a great many situations. In a small room, sitting across from American interrogators, it would become something else entirely. It would become a blindfold. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, there was the storm. By late March of 1944, the situation at Truk had become untenable. Truk Lagoon, once considered Japan's most formidable naval fortress in the Central Pacific, had been hit hard by American carrier aircraft in February. Ships sunk at anchor, planes destroyed on the ground. The base that Tokyo had counted on as an anchor point for the entire Pacific defense was no longer safe. Admiral Koga made the decision to move. Combined Fleet Headquarters would relocate south, from Palau to Davao, in the Philippines. On the evening of March 31st, 2 aircraft were prepared for departure. Koga would take one plane. Fukudome would take the other. It was a routine precaution. Senior commanders traveling separately, so that one bad stroke of luck couldn't take out both men at once. No one in Palau that night had a reliable weather report. The forecasting equipment available to Japanese forces in 1944 simply wasn't up to the task of tracking a typhoon moving fast across open water. They flew into the dark, and the dark had a storm waiting in it. What happened next unfolded in 2 very different ways, and the contrast between them is something history has never fully resolved. Koga's plane vanished. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. The commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet simply disappeared into the night sky and was never seen again. For weeks, Tokyo kept his death a secret, telling no one outside the innermost circle of command for fear of what the news might do to morale. It remains, to this day, one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. Fukudome's plane went down differently. It hit the water hard, somewhere off the coast of Cebu. Men were lost. The aircraft was destroyed. But Fukudome survived, pulled from the wreckage by local civilians who had heard the crash and gone out into the storm to look. He was alive, and somewhere in the dark water behind him, or washed up on a stretch of beach he couldn't see, the briefcase had come to rest in someone else's hands. The Philippines in 1944 was occupied territory. Japanese forces had controlled the islands since the spring of 1942, following the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. But occupation is not the same as control. Across the Philippine archipelago, a network of guerrilla fighters had kept the resistance alive, operating in the hills and jungles, maintaining contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia through clandestine radio links. These were not amateurs. Many were former soldiers of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, men who had fought at Bataan, who had escaped capture, and who had spent 2 years waiting for the chance to do something that mattered. When the briefcase surfaced near Cebu, it made its way quickly up the chain of command to Colonel Ruperto Canglian, one of the most capable guerrilla commanders in the islands. Canglian understood immediately that what he was holding was not an ordinary set of military papers. He passed it through secure channels to SWPA, Southwest Pacific Area Intelligence, the American command operating out of Australia under General MacArthur. The documents were translated, they were studied, they were understood, and then the Japanese made a move that confirmed just how much those papers were worth. A Japanese naval vessel arrived off the coast of Cebu. The demand was straightforward. Return the documents, return the prisoner. Kanglian and his men said no. Let that sit for a moment. These were Filipino guerrillas, lightly armed, operating in secret, under occupation, staring down a Japanese warship and refusing to hand over what they had found. They knew what a no might cost them. They said it anyway. The documents stayed where they were. Fukudome remained in custody, and the clock, though no one knew it yet, had already begun to run. Fukudome was transferred to American custody within days of his capture. He was not mistreated. He was not broken down. He was simply placed in a room with officers from the Office of Naval Intelligence and asked questions. Here is what Fukudome knew at that moment. He knew he had been in a plane crash. He knew he had been pulled from the water. He knew he was a prisoner of war. And he believed, with complete conviction, that the briefcase he had been carrying was somewhere at the bottom of the sea. That belief was the foundation of everything that followed in that room. He sat down across from his interrogators, carrying the full weight of a career built on the assumption that Japan's secrets were impenetrable. And he gave them nothing. That is not a dramatization. That is what the historical record shows. Fukudome did not cooperate. He did not answer questions about fleet dispositions. He did not discuss defensive strategy. He did not confirm or deny anything of substance. When the Americans asked about Japanese intentions in the Central Pacific, silence. When they pressed him on the Mariana Islands, on carrier deployments, on the chain of command after Koga's disappearance, he gave them the kind of answers that aren't really answers. General, vague, carefully nothing. He had been trained for precisely this, and from where he sat, there was no reason to believe the training wasn't working. The Americans were asking questions, which meant, as far as he could tell, they were still searching, still guessing, still trying to piece together a picture from fragments they didn't fully understand. He was not going to help them finish it. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that they had already finished it, weeks ago, without him. Post-war accounts, not a verbatim transcript, but accounts from those who were there, suggest that at some point during the interrogation, the Americans placed something on the table in front of him, a translated copy of the Z-Plan. His Z-Plan, the document he had been carrying, the document he believed was gone. There are no dramatic words recorded for this moment, no outburst, no confession. What the accounts describe is simpler than that, and in some ways more devastating. He looked at what was on the table, and he understood. Not that he had been broken by a clever interrogator, not that he had slipped up, or said too much, or given something away under pressure. He understood something worse than any of that. He understood that he had lost before he ever sat down in that chair. The briefcase had not gone to the bottom of the sea. The people who pulled him from the water had not been bystanders with no idea what they were holding. The Americans had not been guessing. They had known, from the moment those documents landed on a desk in Australia, exactly what Japan was planning, exactly where Japan intended to make its stand, and exactly how Japan expected the next great battle of the war to unfold. Every careful non-answer he had given in that room had been, in a sense, unnecessary. They hadn't needed him to talk. They had needed him to sit there while they confirmed what they already knew. That is what broke him, not his will, not his composure, but the architecture of the advantage he had counted on. It was gone. Fukudome was eventually returned to Japan in a prisoner exchange. He went home. He resumed his duties. He told almost no one what had happened in that room. But the Z plan did not go home with him, and 11 weeks after a typhoon brought down his plane, the consequences of that night were about to arrive at full force. By June of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was playing with what remained of its cards, and what remained was still considerable, but only if used exactly right, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. The Americans were moving on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. For Japan, this was not a peripheral concern. The Marianas sat inside what Tokyo had designated the innermost ring of the empire's defense. Lose them, and American B-29 bombers, the largest, longest-range aircraft in the world at that time, would be within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. There was no fallback position beyond the Marianas. This was the line. Japan's naval commanders knew it. They had updated the Z plan into a new operational order called Operation A-Go, after learning that the original documents had been compromised. New name, new details, but the underlying logic, the fundamental shape of how Japan intended to fight this battle, that hadn't changed. Because strategic thinking doesn't reset overnight. You can change the pieces on the board. You cannot so easily change the mind of the man moving them. And the Americans, having read the Z plan cover to cover, understood that mind very well. The Japanese fleet launched its attack in 4 waves. Nearly 500 aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers rose from carrier decks and headed east toward the American task force. It was, on paper, an overwhelming force. What the Japanese pilots flew into was not what they expected. The Americans had radar, not just the basic early warning equipment that both sides had been using for years, but a system refined through 2 years of combat experience, operated by men who knew exactly how to read it, supported by a fighter direction network that could put the right planes in the right place faster than anything Japan had developed. The Hellcat, the Navy's frontline fighter in 1944, was a different animal from what Japan had faced earlier in the war. Faster, tougher, better armed, and flown by pilots who had been training while Japanese pilot training had been quietly falling apart, gutted by 2 years of attrition. The first Japanese wave ran into American fighters while still more than 60 miles from the fleet. The second wave fared no better. By the time the third and fourth waves arrived, the pattern was already clear, and there was nothing Japan could do to change it. American pilots, coming back to their carriers that evening, were loose with their words on the radio. One of them called it a turkey shoot. The name stuck. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed over those 2 days. 2 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk by American submarines on the same day, going down even as their own aircraft were still in the air above them. It was the end of Japanese carrier aviation as a functional force. They would never fully reconstitute it. Now, a fair question deserves a straight answer. Did the Z plan cause all of this? Historians have debated that for 80 years, and the honest answer is not directly, not alone. American radar, American pilots, American aircraft, those were the instruments of the destruction. But here is what the Z plan gave the Americans that no amount of radar could provide. It gave them the architecture of Japanese thinking. Not just where Japan would deploy its ships, but how Japan's commanders expected a battle to unfold. What they would do when the first wave failed. How they would respond when the plan started to unravel. The Americans didn't just know Japan's moves. They understood that Japan had no real contingency when those moves didn't work. A briefcase left a plane. Filipino guerrillas made a choice. An admiral sat in a room and said nothing because he thought there was nothing left to say. 11 weeks, from the night of the crash to the morning of the turkey shoot. That is how long it took for one lost briefcase to help unravel the last great naval air campaign Japan would ever launch. Wars end, and the people who lived through them go on, or they don't. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome went on. He continued to serve through the final year of the war, commanding forces in various theaters as Japan's situation grew darker by the month. He survived the surrender in August of 1945. In the years that followed, he was called to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Allied prosecutors spent years trying to untangle who had ordered what, and who had known what, and who bore responsibility for the conduct of the war. Fukudome testified. He was not convicted of war crimes. He lived quietly in post-war Japan until his death in 1971. By most accounts, he never spoke publicly about what had happened in that interrogation room. Some things, apparently, a man keeps to himself. Admiral Koga, the man who designed the ZEED plan, the man whose plane vanished the same night Fukudome's went down, was never found. Tokyo awarded him a posthumous promotion to the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. A formal honor for a man whose fate the sea had never seen fit to explain. And Ruperto Kanglian, the guerrilla commander who had received the briefcase, who had looked a Japanese warship in the eye and said no, he became the Secretary of National Defense of the Philippines after the war. He had earned it. Here is something worth sitting with before we close. Almost every account of the ZEED Plan affair, in American military histories, in naval archives, in the books written by scholars on both sides of the Pacific, tells the story from two directions: Japanese and American, the briefcase, the interrogation, the battle. Kanglian and his guerrillas appear, if they appear at all, as a brief footnote between the crash and the translation, a handoff, a logistical detail. That is not what they were. They were an occupied people living under a military force that had demonstrated repeatedly and without ambiguity what happened to those who resisted. They did not have radar. They did not have carriers. They did not have the full picture of what was in those documents or what it might mean for the war. What they had was the briefcase and a Japanese warship sitting offshore telling them to hand it over, and the understanding that their answer was going to have consequences either way. They chose the harder answer. That choice, made in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, by men whose names don't appear in most history books, was as consequential as anything that happened in any interrogation room or any admiral's quarters. History has a habit of remembering the people with the biggest ships. It doesn't always do right by the people who made the biggest difference. You don't need a fleet to change a war. Sometimes it's a storm moving faster than the forecasts said it would. A briefcase that didn't sink when it should have. A group of fighters who decided that some things were worth the risk. One piece of information in the right hands, at the right moment, can do what no armada can. That was true in 1944. It is still true today. Before you go, I want to be straight with you about something. The title of this video says, "The Admiral laughed at his interrogators." I don't know that he laughed. No transcript records it. No first-hand account confirms it. What the record does show is that he didn't cooperate, that he sat in that room, composed and unbothered, certain that the Americans were working without the information they needed. That certainty, that calm, trained confidence, is what the title is reaching for. Whether there was a smile on his face, I honestly cannot tell you. The title also says, "One map broke him." It wasn't one map. It was a full set of operational documents. And broke is a strong word for a man who gave away nothing and went home. What broke, if that's the right word, was the position he thought he held. The sense that he was protecting something that had, in fact, already been lost. That is a real thing that happened, It just happened more quietly than a title can capture in a single line. The real story, a typhoon, a briefcase, and a group of Filipino fighters who refused to stand down, doesn't need much help from me to be remarkable. It already is.